Hello! You guys like my new setup? You can see my lovely library. Today we're going to do something a little differently than what we usually do on this channel. We're going to respond to a video made by another creator. I am certain many of you are familiar with Knowing Better. Knowing Better is a channel that I have followed and been a fan of for many years. I love their content and their videos. They do great stuff and great research. I love their analysis. And a couple months ago, they did a couple of videos on my field, Indigenous American history. Mainly, they did a big 2.5 hour long video that was a great summary of basically the entire history of U.S. Indigenous relations. And then they did a couple follow-up videos, so they have about 3 hours of Indigenous related content on their channel now. They are all great videos. You should go check them out. I'll leave links to them in the description down below. KB clearly did their homework, and I appreciate the amount of effort that they put into those videos. There is one point, though, that he makes that I have to take contention with, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this video today. For those of you new to this channel, welcome to Indigenous History Now. Here we discuss the history, culture, and languages of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere, primarily focusing on the lands that would become the United States. Okay, let's roll the video, and then we'll talk about it.
Following a series of treaties and laws over many decades, some well-intentioned, some not, the federal government decided to hold Indian land, quote, in trust, in order to prevent non-Indians from ever buying that land. Is it really any wonder that this community is mired in poverty? So what can be done? For starters, end the trust system. Let Indians do what they want with the land they own.
This is pretty rare, but I actually find myself in agreement with PragerU, at least when it comes to their proposed solution, though they aren't advocating for it because they want individual families to build generational wealth, or for reservations to attract businesses like Walmart. You have to keep in mind that PragerU is funded by the fossil fuel industry.
The other effect of this absurdity is that Indians can't develop this land that they don't own. Indian reservations contain almost 30% of the nation's coal reserves west of the Mississippi, 50% of potential uranium reserves, and 20% of known oil and gas reserves.
Yikes! Is PragerU right? Let's discuss. Basically, the thesis of this video, this PragerU video that he is referencing, is that the problems of poverty on reservations are caused by the federal trust status of land, and that to solve reservation poverty, end the trust status. Now, what is the trust status? There are lots of different legal categories of the title of how land is held on reservations. Some is held in fee simple by non-natives, some is held in fee simple by natives, some is owned by the tribal government, and then there is the federal trust land. This is land that is owned by the federal government and held in trust for the benefit of the tribe. The tribe can do with that land what it chooses except to sell it. Now, KB is right in pointing out that the origins of the trust status are overtly racist and paternalistic. The trust status was conceived because non-Native America did not think indigenous people were capable of managing their own affairs, so the US government had to do it for them, lest they be taken advantage of by some unscrupulous real estate developer or something like that. That was the way that it was sold, but let's be honest here, it was just a way for the federal government to be able to do whatever it wanted with indigenous land without needing to get the consent of indigenous people. And there are a few court cases, such as Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock, which I believe was either 1905 or 1915, which is still standing law today. It has never been overturned. It's referred to as the Dred Scott of Indigenous law, where the Supreme Court flat out says indigenous people are mentally incapacitated, they're no more mentally developed than children, and the state needs to look after them as a parent to a child. They are legally considered wards of the state. There are only two categories of people in this country that are considered wards of the state: psychiatric patients and indigenous people. That legal status does still hold today. Those cases were not, like I said, those cases have not yet been overturned. So KB is right in pointing out that the origins of the trust status are overtly paternalistic and racist. However, the trust status today has kind of morphed into something else. And this is largely because, for most of American history, the two major political parties in this country may have disagreed on a lot of things, but they pretty much agreed on everything with regards to indigenous people. So the United States government was able to agree on all of its colonial policies against indigenous people. That has changed within the last 50 years or so. As tribes have gotten more politically active and asserting their sovereignty, one of the two major parties has become much more supportive of indigenous sovereignty. So nowadays, the federal government is largely divided on indigenous policy in a way that it didn't used to be. And so trust status today is now more of a security measure for tribes. It's more difficult for the federal government to abuse tribal land and remove it from tribal ownership if it is under trust status than under most other statuses. So many indigenous people today are very supportive of the trust system. Anecdotally, I had the opportunity several years ago to speak with a former tribal council member of one of the tribes here in Washington. And I asked her, what would you change about the tribal federal relationship? What is one of the biggest problems with that relationship that tribes are facing today? And she gave me an answer that I absolutely was not expecting, and that is putting land in trust. Just as difficult as it is to take land out of trust, it is also very difficult when you have a divided government where, one party wants to have more access to indigenous land and one party wants to be more protective of indigenous land. Because of that divide, it's also very difficult to get land into the trust status. So there is a lot of land that tribes own that they want to transfer into trust that the federal government is not acting on. So again, KB is right at pointing out the origins of the trust status are problematic, but this is one of many instances where indigenous people have taken something, they've taken an institution or a policy that was originally intended to be to their harm and have turned it on its head to their benefit. Going back to the thesis of this PragerU video, we have our two main questions to explore here. Is poverty caused by the trust status? And can ending the trust status and privatizing reservation land end poverty? Now, to be fair, KB is advocating for the second of these, but KB himself does not agree with PragerU on their first point. Knowing Better goes into great detail on their video of the long and sordid history of federal indigenous policy and all the many reasons that cause poverty on reservations today other than just the trust status. So let's get to this first question. Does the trust status cause poverty by promoting the underdevelopment of reservations? First, there are legitimate issues with the trust status. Both KB and PragerU rightly bring up it is difficult for indigenous people to buy property off the reservation. Banks like to use property as collateral. People who live on the reservation on trust status land don't own the property, so it can't be used as collateral. Anecdotally, several years ago, I had the opportunity to speak with a Washington state senator who was a registered member of the Tulalip tribe. And he told me a story of several years before this, probably like 90s or early 2000s or something like that. He bought a house in the Washington, D.C. area to facilitate some of the political work he was doing over there. And he had a great income, he had fantastic credit, and he got approved for a loan for a house that was about $200,000, which at that time was pretty decent, in less than a month. His file was open and closed in less than a month, which for anybody who's gone through the real estate process, that's pretty decent, that's pretty fast. Except because they couldn't hold his land on the Tulalip Res as collateral, they charged him a 12% interest rate. This at a time when most interest rates were less than 4%. So imagine what it's like for most other reservation residents who are in a less strong financial position than this gentleman was. It can be very difficult for tribal members who want to move off the reservation to get land off the reservation. And businesses do tend to avoid setting up shop on trust land because they don't like leasing land, they like owning land. So there are some legitimate problems here. But does it go so far as to be the driving force behind poverty on reservations? Point blank, no. There are lots of different reasons for what causes poverty in reservation communities. One that is far, far more significant than any problems with the trust system is that we are talking here about survivors of genocide. What the United States and other European imperial powers tried to do to indigenous people meets all of the criteria for the UN definition of the crime of genocide. We will be exploring this plenty throughout the course of this channel. We are talking about communities who are dealing with the intergenerational trauma of half a millennia of governments and states attempting to eradicate their existence. That's going to cause issues. I mean, just within the past 150 years, we had the boarding schools, which I did not learn a single word about until going to college. Within the last year and a half or so, there has been more public awareness about the boarding schools, which is good. So, I heavily disagree with PragerU's assertion that the trust system is the main driving cause behind poverty on reservations. There are plenty of causes, and this is definitely nowhere near in the top of them. So moving to the second point, the point that both PragerU and KB agree on, would ending the trust system and privatizing reservation land bring about an end to reservation poverty? And we have an advantage here, because it's been done twice before. Privatization of reservation land has been tried twice before. So we have two case studies that we can look at. In either instance, after land on reservations was privatized, did poverty get better or worse on reservations? Well, let's look at the first instance. The first instance was the allotment policy. It began in 1887 and ran until 1934. Now, the allotment of reservations was not something that was concocted up just in 1887. The federal government had wanted to do this and had worked a provision of allotment into many Indigenous treaties before this, but 1887 is when it really started in force and was applied across all reservations. What is allotment? Before 1887, the land of a reservation was held in common. It was not privately owned by anybody. And it was not surveyed. The only surveying of reservation land that was done was just the boundaries of the reservation. So in 1887, the General Allotment Act was passed, also called the Dawes Act, named after the senator who sponsored it. And what the Dawes Act did was to survey out all land on reservation into individual parcels. And those parcels would be allotted to tribal members. A single man could get an allotment of a certain size, a man with a family could get an allotment of a certain size, etc. Once all land on a reservation had been allotted to all the tribal members, any land remaining was declared surplus and was open to non-Indigenous settlement. And over the approximately 45 years of this policy, 90 million acres of land, that was most of it protected, supposed to be reserved for the tribe's use in perpetuity by treaty, 90 million acres passed out of tribal ownership. That was 2/3 of Indigenous land at the time. And this created the modern checkerboarding of Indigenous reservations, where land all over a reservation is split between native and non-native ownership. Now, this was sold as a benevolent gift to the Indian. You had a movement at the time which wanted to see the federal government change tack from actively murdering Indigenous people to being a little nicer to them. And this demographic that was seen as the heartthrobs came up with the allotment and the assimilation policies. And the idea here was that Indigenous people on reservations are living in abject poverty, and it's because the government is standing in their way by not letting them own their land privately. If they had the private ownership of land, the wheels of capitalism could turn and bring in investment from businesses who could set up industries, domestic industries on these reservations. The Indigenous people could own their own land and farm their own land and learn the benefits of good, hard middle-class work, and thereby raise their standard of living into American middle-class prosperity. That's how it was sold. But we can all recognize that it was nothing more than just a land grab to open every last bit of land that had not already been stolen from Indigenous people to more white settlement. And what happened as a result of it? Well, not only did 90 million acres of land pass out of Indigenous hands, but poverty got worse, because for the first time we started seeing homelessness on reservations. And this was for two factors. The first factor was, at the time, Indigenous people mostly came from cultures where there was not private ownership of land. They were not familiar with the practice of buying and selling land. Predatory prospectors came in and convinced Indigenous people to sell their land at well below market value. Now, most Indigenous communities had a concept of usufruct rights of land, where somebody could buy from you the ability to use your land, but this did not prevent your access to the land. But this new American style of private ownership, which also included exclusion of access, was new. So many Indigenous people who sold their land thought that they were just selling the use rights to their land and that they could come back and live on it if they need to. This was not the case, and the predatory real estate developers took advantage of this. And so lots of Indigenous people had their land bought out from under them and were now rendered homeless. And another thing that happened was property taxes were levied on this land. The land that was allotted was put under the jurisdiction of local, state, and county governments, who then charged property taxes. Indigenous people had never before had to pay to just live on their land. So many, again, these are already impoverished communities to start with, many could not afford the property taxes, and so their land was condemned and stolen from them. And this was an issue that was made worse by the glut of white landowners and businesses and real estate developers who moved into these reservations, which drove up the price of the land, thereby driving up the property taxes. And predictably, the selling point of businesses are going to come in and move to reservations and set up shop and develop domestic industries, that didn't happen. Free market capitalism brings industrial development to some areas, but it needs areas to extract from. Which category of this did a reservation fall into? Not the industrial development category. So the allotment policy brought in a bunch of non-natives, both private landowners and businesses, who then drove up the price of land, and it did not bring with it economic development and economic opportunities for Indigenous people. So Indigenous people were now made to pay property taxes which kept getting higher because of the higher price of the land, with no increase in their income. So it drove massive homelessness on reservations and made poverty way worse than it already was in 1887. The federal government realized that this policy was a failure. It was a failure if you actually believe that the purpose was to increase the standard of living for Indigenous people, but if the intention was, as we all can recognize that it was, to steal land from Indigenous people, it was a great success. They changed tack in 1934, and with the beginning of the Indian New Deal. The primary piece of legislation for this was the Indian Reorganization Act. The IRA did not undo the damage of allotment, it just prevented further allotment. Every reservation in the country that existed prior to 1934, save one, was allotted. That one reservation was the Red Lake Reservation in northern Minnesota. They were the only reservation that still to this day, all of their land is held in common. Every other reservation got allotted. Fast forward another 15 years, 1953, we see the start of the Termination era. The Termination Period ran from about 1953 to about 1973 or 74-ish. It was about 20 years. This was another era of the federal government wanting to wash its hands of its Indian problem and get out of the business of providing services and respecting the rights of Indigenous people. The termination policy was the federal government would terminate the federal recognition of a tribe. Now, this is what's different from the termination era of privatization versus the allotment era of privatization. With allotment, the land was allotted and open for white settlement. But the reservation was not disestablished, and the status of tribal members as members of a tribe was not changed. The original legislation did have some language that if you accepted an allotment, you would become a U.S. citizen and no longer a tribal member, but that provision was never really enforced. So Indigenous recipients of allotments still had access to the limited amount of services that the government provided for tribal members at the time. Come the 50s, the amount of services that Indigenous people are eligible for from the government is increased compared to what it was in the allotment period. But the termination policy went further than the allotment policy. It terminated the federal recognition of a tribe, which means all of its members are now, legally, according to the U.S. government, no longer Indigenous people and no longer eligible for any of those Indigenous eligible services. So what termination would do is, with the stroke of a pen, the federal government is saying, sorry, you're no longer Indigenous. Again, this was a policy that was sold as removing paternalistic government regulations that get in the way of economic development and prevent the wheels of the free market from doing what they do best and bringing in industrial investment and raising the standard of living by allowing Indigenous people to own their own home and build middle-class equity and build intergenerational wealth. That's how it was sold. Again, that is not what happened. The reservations that were first targeted for termination were targeted specifically because they had an abundance of natural resources. And the way this was sold was saying, hey, look, these guys have great natural resources and they are doing great things for their people exploiting those natural resources. Let's remove these foolish paternalistic regulations of government oversight and let them do all the natural resource exploitation to their heart's content, and let's see what economic prosperity the free market can bring them. But again, it was never about allowing Indigenous people to make better use of their reservation resources. It was always about allowing non-native businesses to come in and harvest those reservation resources. And that's exactly what happened. The first two reservations to be terminated, the first two tribes to be terminated, were Menominee in Wisconsin and Klamath in Oregon. And they were targeted specifically because they had great untapped timber stands. And the timber barons came in and they cut down all the wood and they took all the money out and they left. Like I said before, the free market does bring investment into some areas, but it needs others for extraction. It has never brought investment into rural tribal communities. It has always brought extraction. Timber extraction, agricultural extraction, mining extraction, and extractive jobs. Yeah, a timber company coming in to cut down all your wood is going to bring some jobs, but not a lot, and they don't pay well. And the job opportunities weren't limited to the former tribal members. So a bunch of non-natives were in the pool for these extraction jobs as well. Once again, just the same as with the allotment policy, Indigenous land was opened up to white ownership, white business development. This drove up the price of the land. Indigenous land was also now subject to property taxes. The increasing price of the land drove up the levy of the property taxes. The promised bringing in of industrial development that'll create jobs and income for Indigenous people didn't happen. So they were now dealing with higher costs with the same amount to less income. And again, lots of Indigenous people were driven further into poverty and homelessness than they already were. Now, in both of these instances with the allotment and the termination period, there were Indigenous people who moved away from their reservation communities to the city where there's more opportunities for jobs and employment. And there were some people who were able to break into middle-class stability. But most of the time, if you can't afford living on the res, you sure as heck can't afford living in the city. Most Indigenous people who moved from the res to the city moved from the impoverished reservation to the impoverished part of town, and were now living in the city with not much increase in their standard of living than what they'd been living out on the reservation. They just moved from one environment of poverty to another environment of poverty and weren't able to climb the social ladder into that middle-class prosperity like the privatization advocates then and now were promising. So what does this mean for today? Well, we have two examples of when reservation land was privatized, and both times not only did it not alleviate poverty on reservations, it made it worse drastically. So, and we can see the main reasons why privatization on reservations doesn't work is because it doesn't bring in the promised economic development that is going to create jobs. All it brings is property taxes and higher costs of land, which then, without the economic development, becomes unaffordable. And here's another thing that the PragerU doesn't mention. The idea is you privatize reservation land and suddenly a bunch of businesses are going to want to move from the city to the res to set up shop on the res and bring development and job opportunities and this and that. Businesses and people have been moving out of rural areas all across the country for decades now. This isn't just a reservation problem. Poverty in rural areas, decreasing economic opportunity in rural areas is not just a reservation problem. It is afflicting every majority white rural community out there. Businesses aren't coming to rural areas. They are leaving them. They are going to the city. They are taking jobs away. This has been a trend that we have been seeing for at least the last 50 years or so. The first year or so of COVID reversed it a little bit, with a bunch of folk from the city now able to work remotely, moving to rural areas where it's a little prettier. But this didn't do enough to reverse the trend. The overarching trend is economic opportunity moving out of rural communities of all stripes. If that has been the trend in this country for the last 50 years, what the heck makes PragerU think that opening up reservation land to privatization will suddenly cause all these companies to move onto the res out of a city? I would posit they don't actually think that, because they really don't care about economic opportunities for Indigenous people. They just want to open up the land to business exploitation, because that has always been the motivation behind privatization of reservation land. It has always been sold as a benefit to Indigenous people, but has always just been intended as a matter of exploitation. But I digress. So could you do privatization and have it not make poverty actively worse? The only way I could see that happening is if you didn't charge property taxes for Indigenous people. Because as we saw in the Termination Period and in the Allotment Period, property taxes were one of the driving factors behind making Indigenous land unaffordable. But the same people who are pushing for the privatization of Indigenous land are probably not going to agree with exempting Indigenous landholders from property taxes. But then there's another issue with the privatization of land that I haven't quite brought up yet. And that is, how does ownership of land increase your personal equity? How does it drive intergenerational wealth? Well, land is a speculative asset. I can buy a house and I can sit on that land for 5 years and not do anything to develop and not do anything to it. I not renovate the house, not expand to it, nothing. It is the exact same condition as I bought it 5 years ago, and the value has increased. Why? Because speculation. Demand for land increases the price of land. Other than using that land as collateral to get a loan to buy another house or like buy a car or start a business or something like that, I don't get access to that money until I sell that land. Like, the value of my house increasing doesn't make me richer unless I sell the land. But also, how does that demand work? Someone can only demand an asset that they have the ability to purchase, right? If I am not legally allowed to buy this house, then I have no demand for that house, and I am not going to affect the price of that house. If you were to privatize reservation land, and if you were only to open the purchase of that land to Indigenous people or Indigenous-owned businesses, considering that Indigenous people don't make up a significant portion of the American population, I don't think there would be enough demand to increase the value of that land to middle-class income levels. So you would have to open it up to be able to be purchased by non-native people. And this creates an issue of tribal sovereignty. Non-native people who live within the boundaries of reservations don't like being subject to the jurisdiction of the tribal government because they don't have a say in it. They are not eligible to vote to select members of the tribal government. If the tribal government has jurisdiction over the non-natives living on the res, for those non-natives, this creates an issue of taxation without representation. And there are only two ways to fix this. Either you make non-natives eligible to vote in tribal governments, at which point that now really is no longer a tribal government, or you limit the jurisdiction of the tribe to not be able to enforce its authority over non-natives. And that has been the tactic that the United States government has taken for well over a century. And it has caused the massive problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls on reservations. Indigenous women are the single demographic in this country most likely to be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. 50% of all Indigenous women can be expected to be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Now, sexual assault is usually a domestic violence crime, and domestic violence is usually perpetrated on the same ethnicity. It's usually white on white, black on black. 95% of Indigenous women who are sexually assaulted are assaulted by non-Native perpetrators, the vast majority of those being white. This is because the federal government has stripped the authority from tribes to prosecute non-Indigenous criminals, even when they commit crimes against tribal members on tribal land. Well, within the boundaries of reservation, I should say, and even on the tribal land in the reservation. The checkerboarding creates a jurisdictional nightmare where if a crime is committed, unlike other parts of the country where the police can just get to work doing their job, they have to ascertain on a reservation what was the ethnicity of the perpetrator, what was the ethnicity of the victim, and exactly where on the reservation did this crime occur. What is the legal status of that land? Because if it is in tribal ownership, that means either the tribe or the FBI has jurisdiction. If it is not in tribal ownership, that means the state has jurisdiction. And even if the tribe has jurisdiction, they can only issue sentences of a maximum of 1 year. So the tribes usually try to, if they have jurisdiction, they usually try to get the FBI to take the case. Because if the FBI brings a federal suit against this person, they can be sentenced to more than just 1 measly year. And to be frank and honest, the FBI and state police do not give a shit. The amount of crimes against Indigenous people on reservations that go unsolved is astonishing. Not just because it's difficult with all this jurisdictional jockeying, but state governments and the FBI have long histories of not, just straight up not caring to prosecute crimes on reservations. So Indigenous women are preyed upon because mainly white men know that they can go to a reservation, do whatever the hell they want to an Indigenous woman, and they will get away with it scot-free. So if you were to privatize reservation land and open up even more reservation land to non-Native purchase, you're bringing in even more non-Native people into reservations who are not going to want to be subject to the authority of the tribal government. And that is going to even further deteriorate the tribal government's ability to act as a government and to protect its people. How do we solve the jurisdictional issues and the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls issues on reservations? You either give the tribal governments authority over non-Native people, authority over everybody on a reservation, and allow them to persecute and issue sentences appropriate with the crime, not just 1 stupid year. Or the federal government gives tribes money to buy out all of the non-Native landowners on reservations, preferably both. But going back to the thesis of this video, privatization of reservation land has a history of increasing poverty on reservations, not decreasing it, and the only way you could conceivably privatize reservation land today without increasing poverty would be to not charge property taxes, which probably isn't going to happen, and you would still have issues with worsening problems of tribal sovereignty. So we're left with the question, how do you alleviate poverty on reservations? I don't know. I don't think there is one silver bullet solution. The causes of reservation poverty are complex and multifaceted and way more than just a simplistic solution of government regulation gets in the way. There are some long and traumatic histories behind the conditions on reservations today. I would argue that we have 2 examples of when privatization was proposed as a solution to reservation poverty and made it worse. I would love if any Indigenous people who are watching this could drop down in the comments section, what is your tribal government doing to alleviate poverty on the reservations and bring a good quality of life to its citizens? What do you guys think about this? What do you guys think about the trust status? What do you guys think about the idea of privatizing reservation land? I would love to hear from any Indigenous viewers. That's our video. Thank you all very much for watching. If you're new here and you want to check out more of my content, go peruse the channel. Here are a couple video links on screen. If you're watching this early in the channel's life, don't judge me too harshly for the sound quality of the earliest videos. I know it's not that good, and I'm going to go back and re-record those. If you like what you see, like, subscribe, drop a comment. If you want to support me on Patreon, I have a link down in the description. Thank you all very much for watching. I will see you next time.